Jackie, I start with you and this moment. The committee has privately and publicly been working for what they have finally secured. We've talked about it already this week. It's the testimony of Pat Cipollone. It does not appear to be a coincidence that that will be taped and studied and culled by close of business Friday ahead of the hearings next week.
That's exactly right, Nicole. And I think it's really important to note in my conversations today, even though there are parameters on the conversation that Pat Cipollone has agreed to have tomorrow with committee investigators, that doesn't mean that investigators aren't going to ask him questions that are potentially out of bounds. It will be up to Cipollone to, in that moment, decide whether or not he needs to exert privilege or not. So we could still see quite illuminating moments like that moment with Michael Flynn that we saw during the hearing last week, where he pled the fifth on even the most basic questions of whether or not he thought Joe Biden had fairly won the election. That being said, I think that next week, even outside of seeing these videotaped, transcribed depositions, interviews of Pat Cipollone, is going to be extremely telling, and I think wrap sort of this narrative that we've already seen all together. You talk about looking ahead to the legislative proposals. Tuesday's hearing on extremism and the culture of political violence on the right, I think, is going to directly connect to that. You're going to see, I think, potentially footage and various content that was put out by far-right extremists and by players that we hear from on a consistent basis in Trump's orbit, people like Steve Bannon, Ali Alexander, who were advocating for various things. People like Michael Flynn, again, who was advocating for Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act, to deploy troops to seize voting machines and declare the election to have been rigged. And that, again, ties back to some of the policy reforms that the committee has been discussing and might ultimately making reforms to the Insurrection Act, reforming the Electoral Vote Count Act of 1887 by clarifying certain things that haven't been clarified since these laws were created.
Trump-proofing America's democracy is what it sounds like. I want to play some of what we heard in that dramatic surprise testimony from Cassidy Hutchinson. They could not, under any reasonable standard, be considered protected or privileged conversations. They were conversations among West Wing staff. Let me play some of that.
Having a private conversation with Pat late in the afternoon of the 3rd or the 4th, that Pat was concerned it would look like we were obstructing justice or obstructing the Electoral College count. And I apologize for probably not being very firm with my legal terms here, but that it would look like we were obstructing what was happening on Capitol Hill. And he was also worried that it would look like we were inciting a riot or encouraging a riot to erupt on the Capitol, at the Capitol.
I want to bring Betsy Witcher-Swan into this. I mean, the fact that he was throwing around obstructing justice, obstructing the Electoral College count, and that he was, quote, very worried it would look like we were inciting a riot or encouraging a riot to erupt on Capitol Hill, at the Capitol, is clearly central to the argument that the committee has been making publicly since before the public hearings commenced. Just talk about what dots they're seeking to connect in this public phase, Betsy, with Cipollone's testimony.
What Cipollone, very importantly, might or might not provide to them is corroboration of what Cassidy Hutchinson has already said. Because the committee moved forward on such an unusually short and tight timeline to have Hutchinson's public testimony, they didn't take some steps that normally investigators would take to try to corroborate some of the most important allegations that she made in that hearing. And in fact, it seems pretty clear now in retrospect that Cipollone, that the pressure on Cipollone to come in and testify was ratcheted up dramatically because of what Hutchinson herself testified to in that hearing. If Cipollone goes in and corroborates what Hutchinson said, rather than denying it or asserting executive privilege to try to deflect questions about the conversations that she laid out, That would be an enormous win for the committee. Remember, everything that Hutchinson said about Cipollone in her testimony, none of it was negative. None of it made him look bad. If anything, Cipollone is one of the few number of senior Trump White House administration officials to come through this entire January 6th process looking like he was very much on team normal. He's someone at this point who the committee clearly sees as a credible and an important narrator. And that means that whatever he tells them in this transcribed interview that's coming up on Friday is going to carry significant weight. And of course, in contrast, if Cipollone goes in and he contradicts something that Hutchinson says, then obviously that's going to create an enormous challenge and a significant problem for the Select Committee if they end up having two people who they both view as credible presenting characterizations of what happened that day that aren't consistent for each other. It's actually a really high stakes moment for the committee and has the potential to play a significant role in almost defining the way the rest of their investigation plays out in the coming months.
It's an interesting point, Betsy. What strikes me, though, is that Cassidy Hutchinson is just the most recent witness who has singled out Cipollone. I mean, we heard more about Cipollone from Mr. Donahue, Mr. Jacob, frankly, from the text messages sent by Sean Hannity to Mark Meadows. I mean, he's been ever present in every single one. And even Jared Kushner's testimony is devastating to his father-in-law. He was always threatening to quit. Why was he always threatening to quit? In the DOJ hearing with Donahue and Rosen, he was the sort of man in the room, you know, backing the DOJ non-coup plotting leaders there. I mean, he's so ever present. He'd have to contradict not just Cassidy Hutchinson, but literally every other witness that has testified.
Yeah, that's right. And the important thing also to remember about Cipollone is that he's very much both an uppercase C conservative and a lowercase c conservative. As White House counsel, he was someone who was seen as very cautious, very risk averse, extremely circumspect about the decisions he made. And while he played a key role in defending many of the Trump administration's controversial policies and, of course, squaring off against Adam Schiff, a Select Committee member back in Trump's very first impeachment process, you know, despite that, he's also someone who really is not viewed as a huge risk taker. Does that lowercase c conservatism materialize in this transcribed interview that's going to come up on Friday? We'll find out. When witnesses go into these interviews, there are a lot of ways that they can answer questions while still following the law. They can downplay things. They can assert executive privilege or attorney-client privilege. They can provide minimal details or they can provide maximum details. We saw that those types of changes. We've seen those types of changes, of course. The committee has telegraphed those changes happened in the case of Cassidy Hutchinson, where over the course of 4 depositions, they gained significantly more information from her than they'd had previously. The huge question when Cipollone goes in is, does he go in the mode of, I'm trying to be as helpful as possible to the committee, I'm trying to be as revelatory as possible, to cast as much light as possible, or does he go in with his very very risk-averse hat on? Does he go in with the goal of complying with the subpoena while sharing as little material as he possibly can? And we won't know until later tomorrow.